Brooklyn, New York. December 1934. The city is loud the way only New York can be loud. Horns, steam, arguments bleeding through thin walls, the crash of iron on the docks 3 blocks west. The whole borough is noise and motion and desperation, dressed up as ambition. But on the rooftop of a 6-story tenement on Van Brunt Street, a 12-year-old boy is absolutely still. He has been still for 40 minutes. His name is Daniel Caruso. He is lying flat on tar paper that smells of coal smoke and old rain, his cheek pressed against the wood stock of a battered .22 rifle borrowed from the retired man in apartment 4C. His breath moves in and out in long measured pulls, each exhale controlled, deliberate, almost silent. The cold bites through his wool coat, but he does not shiver. He learned months ago that shivering costs you the shot, so he simply stopped. 40 feet away, a pigeon is feeding on crumbs near the edge of the rooftop parapet. It is grey and fat and oblivious. Its head bobs in that mechanical rhythm that pigeons have, that clockwork tilt, tilt, tilt. Daniel watches the wind move the bird's breast feathers. He reads the direction. He adjusts barely a fraction of an inch to the left. He exhales halfway. He fires. The pigeon drops. Daniel stands, walks to the bird, picks it up by the feet. He holds it for a moment. There is nothing cruel in his face. There is nothing celebratory either. Just a boy doing what needs to be done, the way men 3 times his age do what needs to be done on the docks below. He will sell this one to Russo's on Mulberry Street. 15 cents. Tomorrow he will come back and do it again. This is how Daniel Caruso learns patience. This is how he learns to read wind. This is how he learns the single most important lesson of his life. A lesson that no military academy, no training manual, no field instructor will ever teach him as cleanly or as honestly. Move slowly enough, and they never see you coming. His father, Marco Caruso, came over from Palermo in 1911, 19 years old and carrying nothing but a name and a willingness to bleed for wages. He found work at the Red Hook waterfront, loading and unloading cargo ships, doing the kind of labor that hollows a man out over decades. By the time Daniel was born, Marco's hands were no longer hands in the conventional sense. They were instruments, calloused, cracked, permanently curved from the grip of ropes and hooks. Marco was not a complicated man. He believed in 3 things: work, family, and the church, in roughly that order, depending on the week. He did not talk about his feelings. He did not need to. You could read everything Marco Caruso felt in the way he sat at the dinner table at the end of a shift. The slow, deliberate way he pulled off his boots, the way he exhaled like a man setting down something unimaginably heavy. The family lived in a 3-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor. 5 people. Daniel, the oldest, then his sister Rosa, then his brother Tommy, who was slow in school but fast with tools. Their mother, Conchetta, kept the apartment clean with a ferocity that suggested cleanliness was her private war against the neighborhood's entropy. Money was never enough. It was enough to survive and not enough for anything beyond survival. There was no shame in this. Half the block lived the same way. But Daniel understood early that his family needed more than his father's dock wages, and he was 12 years old when he found his solution on the rooftops. The pigeons were everywhere. Restaurant owners in Little Italy paid good money for fresh ones. An old man named Sal Ferraro in 4C had a .22 he never used anymore, arthritic fingers making the trigger impossible. He lent it to Daniel on the condition that the boy cleaned it after every use and split the earnings 10%. It was Daniel's first business negotiation. He agreed immediately. What followed over the next 2 years was something that looked from the outside like a boy hunting pigeons for pocket money. What it actually was a graduate course in applied physics, behavioral psychology, and human invisibility. Daniel learned that pigeons have exceptional peripheral vision and a nearly instantaneous flight reflex. If you move too fast, not dramatically fast, just ordinarily fast, the speed a person walks across a room, they scatter. To get close enough for a clean shot, you had to become something other than a person. You had to become part of the rooftop. He learned to control his breathing so completely that on cold mornings, the condensation from his exhales was nearly invisible. He learned to read the way air moved through the urban canyon of Van Brunt Street by watching cigarette smoke from windows 3 floors below and calculating how that same wind would behave 40 feet higher. He learned that the sun's angle changed the reflective quality of the rifle barrel at different hours, and he began wrapping the barrel in burlap during afternoon hunts. He was 12 years old doing this, 13, 14, and then came the shot that changed everything. It was October 1936. Daniel was 14. A pigeon had settled on a ledge of the building across the alley, not the rooftop of his own building, but the one opposite, separated by 20 feet of air and then extending another 160 feet down the block. The bird was at roughly 180 meters. It was a difficult shot for a trained marksman with quality equipment. For a 14-year-old boy with a borrowed .22 in a 20-mile-per-hour crosswind, it was the kind of shot that doesn't get attempted. It gets looked at, considered, and then abandoned. Daniel thought about it for 11 minutes. He calculated the wind, not guessed, calculated, using the smoke from 2 different chimneys and a flag on a building further east to triangulate the direction and approximate the speed. He adjusted his hold point. He breathed. He fired once. The pigeon dropped from the ledge and fell into the alley below. A voice came from behind him, old but sharp. He turned. Standing in the rooftop doorway was a man he had seen in the building but never spoken to. A heavy-set man in his 60s with a veteran's posture, the kind that never fully goes away. Straight spine and squared shoulders worn into the body like grooves in stone. His name was August Heller. He had fought in the Argonne in 1918 and spent the 2 decades since as a machinist in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. He had been watching from the doorway for 3 minutes before the shot. He stared at Daniel for a long moment. Then he said, simply, "That shot, what you just did. Trained riflemen with proper equipment spend 3 years learning how to do that, and most of them still miss." Daniel didn't know what to say. He retrieved the bird from below using the fire escape and came back up. Heller was still standing there. "You ever think about what you're going to do with that?" Heller asked. Daniel looked at him. "Sell it," he said, holding up the pigeon. Heller almost smiled. "I meant the ability." Daniel had not thought about it. He thought about it then. He didn't have an answer. December 10th, 1941. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Daniel Caruso walked into the Army recruitment office on Atlantic Avenue. He was 19 years old. He stood 5 feet 11, lean and angular, in a way that suggested he had never quite had enough to eat growing up, with grey eyes that had the quality of looking at everything from a considered distance. The recruiter barely looked up from his papers before asking the standard questions. Daniel answered them. He listed no special skills. He said infantry. He was assigned to basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, which he completed without difficulty or distinction. His drill sergeants noted that he was quiet, listened well, and had an unusual ability to remain calm under stress. The kind of calm that reads as indifference until you watch a man long enough to understand it isn't. He qualified as expert marksman on his first attempt, not simply expert. Perfect. Every round inside the bullseye at 300 yards in a crosswind. The range officer scored it twice because he didn't believe it. The Army sent him to sniper school at Camp Perry, Ohio. Camp Perry in the spring of 1942 was a place of structured certainty. The doctrine was clear. The instructors were former combat veterans who believed in their methods the way men believe in things that have kept them alive. And the central pillar of sniper doctrine, the one non-negotiable truth they hammered into every candidate, was this: shoot and relocate. Never fire more than 3 shots from one position. After 3 shots, move. The reasoning was sound and well tested. A skilled enemy observer could triangulate a shooter's position from muzzle flash and the audible crack of the bullet within 3 shots. If you stayed put, you died. Mobility was survival. The manual said so, the instructors said so, the war record said so. Daniel understood the logic. He did not dispute it. He understood it completely. But he also understood something the manual did not cover. Something he had learned not in a classroom, but on the rooftops of Red Hook, lying still in the cold while the city moved beneath him. There were situations where movement was the danger, where the act of relocating exposed a shooter more completely than staying still ever could. Dense terrain, fixed defensive positions, overwhelming enemy numbers moving fast through a choke point. In those situations, the math of shoot and relocate broke down. In those situations, stillness was not a liability. Stillness was the weapon. He raised this in a training session. He explained his reasoning methodically without emotion. The lead instructor, a compact, weathered man named Pratt, who had worked as a scout in the Pacific Theater, cut him off before he finished. "The manual exists because men died to write it," Pratt said. "You don't rewrite doctrine in a classroom, candidate." Yeah, Daniel did not argue. He went back to following the protocol as instructed. But his evaluation reports began to collect a phrase that would follow him like a shadow. Demonstrates resistance to standard relocation protocol. 3 months into the course, he was called before a review board. 2 instructors, 1 administrative officer. They read from his file. His shooting scores were the highest in the class. Not close, not nearly as high, the highest. But his psychological assessment flagged him as a relocation risk. The recommendation was removal from advanced training. Daniel sat in that room and did not flinch. He had sat still in colder places for longer. He was 2 days from being removed from the program when a man he had never spoken to walked into the situation. Lieutenant Arlo Taft was not a professional soldier in any meaningful sense. He was 34 years old, a game warden from Laramie County, Wyoming, who had spent the better part of 15 years tracking elk and pronghorn through high-altitude terrain in conditions that most people would not survive the first night. He had commissioned as a reserve officer in 1940 more out of a sense of obligation than ambition, and found himself at Camp Perry as a liaison between the training division and field intelligence. He was not an instructor. He had no authority over the evaluation board. What he had was a habit of watching. He had been watching Daniel Caruso for 6 weeks. He had watched him at the range, watched him in the field exercises, watched the way the young man from Brooklyn moved, or rather, didn't move, in ways that Taft recognized from his years in the high country. It was the stillness of a predator, not aggressive, not tense, just absolutely, completely present, the way a mountain lion is present before it moves. The way a good hunting dog is present when it has locked on a scent and is waiting for the right moment. Taft was not a man given to advocacy. He generally let the systems do what systems do. But what was happening with Caruso struck him as the kind of institutional waste that costs lives in the field. He wrote a single paragraph on a single sheet of paper and placed it in Daniel's file before the board finalized its decision. Candidate demonstrates unconventional but highly replicable methodology based on terrain exploitation and behavioral prediction rather than mechanical protocol adherence. Shooting scores represent the highest documented in this training cycle. Recommend provisional acceptance into advanced track pending field assessment. The Army trains men to be effective. This candidate is already effective. The question is whether we are willing to learn from that. He signed it and walked away. He never mentioned it to Daniel. He never mentioned it to anyone. The board reversed its recommendation. Daniel was admitted to the advanced track provisionally with the notation that he would require close monitoring. He graduated at the top of his class. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. What began in the pre-dawn hours of that Monday morning was the single largest German offensive on the Western Front since the invasion of France. 28 divisions, 2,000 artillery pieces. The attack came out of dense fog and complete surprise, striking American lines held by only 4 divisions spread across an 80-mile front. Within the first 6 hours, 41 German battalions had struck 7 American battalions. The math of that is not complicated. It is devastating. Communication lines were severed in the first hours. Units that had been holding their positions suddenly found themselves cut off from the battalions on either side. The front did not bend, it shattered. Among the fragments that fell through the cracks was a 12-man squad from the 99th Infantry Division, including a 22-year-old rifleman from Brooklyn who had graduated at the top of his sniper training class and had been reassigned to standard infantry when the army ran short of sniper-specific billets. He had spent months doing the work of a rifleman and none of the work of a sniper. The Springfield M1903 he carried was his own quiet insistence, signed out at the armory with a request that had taken 3 weeks to approve. They retreated into the dense forest south of Rocherath, the 12 of them, with a destroyed radio and ammunition for roughly 3 days of sustained contact. Below their hillside position, a narrow logging road ran east to west through the valley, and on that road, the men of the 12th SS Panzer Division were moving west in a steady, purposeful stream. Infantry, half-tracks, motorcycle couriers. The engine of an offensive in full momentum. The man commanding their 12-person fragment was Sergeant Brendan Callahan. Callahan was 34 years old and had worked construction in South Boston for 12 years before the war. He was built like a load-bearing wall, wide, dense, and seemingly structural. He had a face that suggested he had seen things and processed them and put them away in some internal file he would never open in public. He did not frighten easily. He did not speak casually. When he said something, it was because he had already finished thinking about it. He had looked at the terrain for 20 minutes before issuing his order. Nobody moves. They stay hidden, they let the Germans pass, and they wait for the front to stabilize enough for them to slip back to friendly lines. Standard doctrine for an isolated unit. Tactically sound. The decision of a man who understood that in this situation the goal was survival, not engagement. His men agreed. They dug in. They waited. Daniel Caruso looked at the road. He looked at it the way he had looked at rooftops in Brooklyn, not as an obstacle or a threat, but as a structure with exploitable geometry. He studied the angles, the sight lines, the way the tree line created natural choke points that forced the moving column into predictable patterns. He looked at the terrain, the frozen ground, the positions where a shooter could not be approached without exposing himself. He looked at the massive oaks on the hillside behind their position, their winter canopies bare but dense enough, their branching patterns offering natural platforms at height. He thought for a long time. Then he approached Callahan. It was the night of December the 17th, and the temperature had dropped below 15 degrees. Callahan was crouched against a fallen log, eating cold rations from a tin, when Daniel sat down beside him. "I can shut it down," Daniel said. He said it quietly, without preamble, the way a man states a fact he has already verified. Callahan looked at him. "Shut what down?" "The road." Daniel nodded toward the valley below. "I can make it unusable. Force them to find another route. If they have to reroute even 2 miles, that's hours of supply delay for their whole advance." Callahan stared at him. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Sniper doctrine says, shoot and move. You stay in one spot, they find you. Counter-snipers, spotters, mortars. You'll be dead by noon." "Not in the right position," Daniel said. "There's no such position. I grew up finding positions nobody could see me in, 40 feet above the ground, broken sight lines. I stay still enough, and I can stay still long enough. They won't locate me." Callahan was quiet. He looked at the road. He looked at Daniel. He recognized something in the younger man's face. Not bravado, not recklessness, something older and colder. Certainty. The particular certainty of a man who has tested himself enough to know precisely what he can do. "You understand what you're proposing?" Callahan said. It was not a question. "Yes. This is a court-martial offense, disobeying standing orders on a separated unit. You don't have authorization for this." "I know." Callahan set down his tin. He looked at the road for a long time. He thought about the 12 men behind him. He thought about the road and what it meant for the Germans using it, and what it meant for the Americans trying to slow them down. He thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and the narrow corridor of ways it might go right. Finally, he said, "I'll deny this conversation happened. If they come for you with mortars, I can't spare men to pull you out. You're on your own." Daniel nodded once. "That's all I need." He stood and moved off into the darkness, toward the trees. What Callahan did next, Daniel Caruso would not learn for 53 years. The moment Daniel disappeared into the shadows, Callahan moved to the squad's backup radio, a secondary set they carried, damaged during the retreat, its casing cracked and its antenna partially bent. He had tried it twice since the retreat and gotten nothing but static. He tried it again now, working the frequency dial with cold fingers, transmitting into the void. He requested an extraction order. He requested permission to withdraw all personnel to friendly lines. He transmitted the squad's approximate coordinates. He transmitted twice. The radio crackled and sputtered and eventually died completely. He did not know if anyone received those transmissions. He never found out. He sat down with his back against an oak tree at the perimeter of their position, and he waited. He held his service pistol in his right hand, resting on his knee. If the situation deteriorated past the point of control, Callahan had decided he would fire 3 shots into the air, a signal to get down, to abort, to come back to the earth. He sat there until the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the frozen canopy above. His boots were wet inside. His hands had stopped feeling things correctly around 3 a.m. He did not sleep. Above him, somewhere in the darkness of the oak forest, a 22-year-old boy from Brooklyn was tying himself to a tree with parachute cord. Daniel had spent 2 hours in the dark preparing the position. He selected the tree carefully. A massive white oak 60 yards behind the squad's perimeter, its trunk wider than a man's arm span, its roots anchored deep enough to suggest it had been standing since before the Revolution. He climbed 40 feet into the canopy until he found the place where 3 thick branches intersected and created a natural platform. 3 feet wide, 4 feet long, barely enough space to exist, let alone work. He tied himself to the trunk with parachute cord, threading it under his arms and around the back of the tree so that if he lost consciousness, he would not fall. He arranged pine boughs along the platform to break up his silhouette. He positioned his 20 reserve rounds within reach, each one oriented the same direction so he would not need to look when he loaded. He set his canteen inside his coat against his body to keep it from freezing. He adjusted the weaver scope of his Springfield and checked his sight picture against the road below. 800 yards, the pale strip of road visible between the trees as a lighter grey against the darker grey of frozen forest floor. He settled in. He controlled his breathing. He became, as much as a human being can become, part of the tree. Below him, the road was quiet for now. To the east, the sound of artillery rolled across the Belgian landscape like distant thunder. Somewhere in that thunder, a war was trying to find its shape. American lines were breaking and holding and breaking again. Men were dying in numbers that would not be fully understood for years. But in this one small piece of the Ardennes, on this one narrow road through this one frozen valley, A 12-year-old boy's education on the rooftops of Brooklyn was about to collide with the full machinery of a German SS division. At 6:47 in the morning of December 18, 1944, the first 6 soldiers appeared on the road below, walking west, rifles slung, cigarettes in hand, moving with the casual confidence of men who believed they were miles behind the danger. Daniel Caruso tracked the lead soldier through his scope. He breathed out. He waited. He let them reach the center of his kill zone. And then the man who had learned to disappear on a Brooklyn rooftop proved that stillness, absolute and complete, can be the most lethal force in the world. The first shot came at 6:47 in the morning. The lead soldier was walking with the ease of a man on his way to somewhere unremarkable, rifles slung across his back, cigarette burning between 2 fingers. Men rarely are in the moments before it. Men rarely are in the moments before it happens. Daniel tracked him through the scope and waited until the man reached the center of the kill zone, the stretch of road where the tree line on both sides created the maximum obstacle to any immediate cover. He exhaled halfway, stilled everything, and fired. The soldier collapsed sideways into the snow. The cigarette landed near his outstretched hand and continued to burn for a moment in the cold air, a small orange point of light in the grey morning. The 5 men behind him stopped. For 2 full seconds, they simply stood on the road and looked at their fallen comrade with the blank incomprehension of men whose understanding of the world has just been violated. There was no clean echo in the dense forest. The shot had dispersed through the frozen trees in a way that gave no clear direction. They did not know where the fire had come from. That 2-second window was all Daniel needed. He worked the bolt, loaded, found the second man in his scope, fired, then the third, then the fourth. By the time the remaining 2 soldiers broke for the tree line, 4 more bodies were on the road. 1 runner made it to cover. The other did not. 5 dead in under 90 seconds. The single survivor returning to his unit with a coherent story about the fire's origin. That was the thing Daniel had worked to prevent. The shots had come from high in the canopy with a suppressed directional signature and no visible muzzle flash in the diffuse morning light. The survivor would report ambush. He would not report sniper. He would report confusion, which was the most valuable thing Daniel could give the situation. Daniel did not move. He settled back into the tree, controlled his breathing, and waited. An hour passed, then another. At 9:15 in the morning, a larger group appeared, 15 soldiers moving in a loose tactical formation, rifles unslung, heads turning in both directions with the alert wariness of men who have been told something is wrong and are trying to understand what. They found the bodies from the earlier engagement almost immediately, and then they made the mistake that cost them everything. They stopped, they clustered, they gathered around the fallen men in that instinctive human way. The need to assess, to understand, to stand together in the face of something incomprehensible, and in doing so they compacted themselves into a target that a trained marksman could not have designed better. Daniel watched them through his scope for 30 seconds. He noted the tightest cluster. He identified the positions that would create the most confusion upon first contact. Then he began firing with a methodical, unhurried cadence. 1 shot, bolt, 1 shot, bolt, working through the group from the center outward. By the time the survivors broke and scattered into the tree line, 12 men were on the road. The 3 who escaped went east, away from the German lines, which told Daniel they were no longer thinking tactically. They were running. He loaded his next rounds and returned to stillness. He had been in the tree for 4 hours. Below him, the valley sat quiet. 300 yards of frozen asphalt and dirt with 17 bodies spread across it in the postures of men stopped mid-motion. Snow had begun falling in light, drifting flakes that accumulated with the indifferent patience of weather. The logging road, which had carried a steady column of men and vehicles since before dawn, was now silent. Below Daniel's position, 60 yards back through the forest, Brendan Callahan listened to the shots and counted. He calculated. He tried to read the pauses between shots the way a doctor reads a pulse, looking for irregularity, for panic, for the change in rhythm that would mean something had gone wrong. The rhythm was steady, almost metronomic. Callahan ate his cold rations and did not sleep. By sunset on December 18th, the end of Daniel's first full day in the tree, he had fired 34 rounds and confirmed 29 kills. His counting was conservative by instinct. He did not include men who had dropped at the tree line and might have crawled further. He counted only what he had seen fall and stay down. He ate the single ration bar he had brought, forcing it down in small pieces despite having no appetite. He drank a measured amount of water from his coat-warmed canteen. He checked his remaining ammunition. He retied the parachute cord where it had loosened against the bark. He arranged himself as comfortably as the 3-by-4-foot platform allowed, which was not particularly comfortable. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees as night settled in. The cold did not arrive gradually. It arrived the way cold arrives in a frozen forest, completely and all at once. Daniel pulled his wool face wrap higher and used the mass of the tree trunk as a windbreak. He did not sleep in the conventional sense. He entered the state of shallow, controlled rest he had practiced on winter rooftops as a teenager. Not unconscious, not fully alert, but aware enough to register a sound that did not belong. Still enough to conserve the heat that was all that stood between him and hypothermia. He thought about his father. He thought about the dock at Red Hook in winter, the way Marco's hands looked when he came home from a shift in January, white at the knuckles, raw at the fingertips, the skin cracked in the deep cold. He remembered asking once if it hurt. His father had looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has decided to answer honestly. "Everything hurts," Marco Caruso had said. "You do it anyway." Daniel settled deeper into the tree and did it anyway. Dawn came on December 19th with a grey, reluctant light that turned the snow-covered road below into something that looked like a painting, pale and still and carefully arranged. Daniel had been in the tree for 24 hours. The Germans came again at 8 o'clock in the morning, but differently. They moved in a dispersed tactical formation, spacing themselves at intervals of 15 to 20 yards, using the trees at the road's edge as cover between movements. They were not walking. They were advancing. Someone had briefed them. Someone had looked at the previous day's reports and drawn the correct professional conclusion. There was a shooter with a fixed line of sight on this road, and they needed to treat it as a contested position. There were 11 of them. They moved with training and discipline, bounding forward in pairs, presenting fractional windows of opportunity between cover positions. Daniel took what he could. He was deliberate and patient, firing only when a target presented itself clearly, working at intervals long enough that the crack of each shot had time to disperse through the trees before he fired again. He killed 4 men in 20 minutes. The remaining 7 reached the eastern tree line and held there, and for the better part of an hour the valley settled into a tense silence. They were not retreating. They were waiting. Daniel waited too. He was better at it. At 11:30, 2 of the 7 broke north through the forest, moving fast. The other 5 eventually withdrew east, back the way they had come. He watched them go and reassessed. 29 kills from the previous day, 4 more this morning, 33 total. The road had been effectively closed for 18 hours. What he did not yet know was that 2 miles to the north, a German intelligence officer was unfolding a map and telling a room full of officers that the supply route through the Rocherath sector was not simply delayed, it was contested, and whoever was contesting it had been doing so from the same position for more than 24 hours. They were coming for him now, not as a patrol, as a deliberate operation. The machine gun team arrived at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They had set up 850 yards to the north, at the far edge of Daniel's effective range, far enough that the distance and wind should have made accurate return fire extremely difficult. They had positioned themselves behind a log barrier with clear fields of fire down the road and into the southern tree line where they believed the shooter to be. They did not know he was 40 feet above their suppression zone. Their first burst tore through the canopy 30 feet to Daniel's right, shredding pine branches and sending bark raining down onto his platform. The second burst adjusted left, closer. The gunner was good. Daniel shifted position on the platform, a careful, minimal rotation against the trunk until he had a clean angle north. 850 yards was at the outer edge of his reliable range with the Springfield in these conditions. The wind had picked up since morning, running at roughly 12 miles per hour from the northwest. He needed to account for all of it simultaneously in the seconds between machine gun bursts. He found the gunner in his scope. The man's head and shoulders were visible above the log barrier, making the same assumption Daniel had worked to avoid all day. That distance provided protection. Daniel exhaled. He felt the tree move a fractional amount in the wind, noted it, adjusted. He fired. The machine gun went silent. He worked the bolt and found the assistant gunner reaching for the weapon. He fired again. The man fell back behind the log barrier. What Daniel could not have known in that moment was that the brief exchange had given a German observer exactly what they had been looking for, not his precise position, but the quadrant. The angle of the two shots, triangulated against the last known position of the German gun team, gave a trained observer a narrow cone of forest to work with, 200 yards wide. And in that cone, there were not many trees large enough to hold a man. The report went up through channels. The channels produced a decision. The decision produced 4 81mm mortar tubes being positioned on the road 600 yards to the east. Daniel heard them at 11:17 the next morning, 4 tubes. The thump, 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 thump of the launch sequence came from below the ground rather than above it. Daniel had been in the tree for 36 hours. He heard the sound and understood it in the same moment, and he understood what it meant with the cold clarity of a man who has no illusions left. They had found him. He flattened his body against the platform and locked his legs around the branch below, making himself as narrow as possible. He turned his face into the bark, away from the incoming direction, protecting his eyes. The first salvo hit 40 yards short. The detonations were enormous in the frozen forest. 4 simultaneous explosions sending geysers of earth and snow 30 feet into the air, shaking the ground well enough that Daniel felt it travel up through the oak's root system, through the trunk, through the bark, and into his chest, like a second heartbeat. The pressure wave hit his eardrums even at 40 yards. They were walking the fire toward him. The next salvo would be closer. He calculated. If the crew was competent and unhurried, the second salvo would land within 20 yards. The third, if they walked it consistently, would be within lethal radius. He thought very clearly about the fact that he was 40 feet above the ground, with no fast way down. He acknowledged it. He accepted it. Then he focused entirely on making himself small against the oak and waiting for whatever came next. The second salvo hit 22 yards to his right. The concussion was violent enough to move the oak itself, a massive, rooted thing that had been standing for over a century, shuddering in a way it was not built to shudder. The pine boughs on his platform scattered. A heavy branch, 6 feet above his head, disintegrated and rained wood fragments down onto him. His ears registered a pressure that was not quite sound, a deep ringing that did not diminish quickly. He counted. 12 seconds, roughly, he waited for the third salvo. He waited 15 seconds, then 30, then a full minute. The third salvo did not come. What Daniel Caruso did not know, could not have known from 40 feet up in a frozen oak, was that 3 minutes earlier, a radar station 12 miles to the west had registered the mortar team's firing signature. The system had processed the information automatically, cross-referenced the coordinates, and generated a fire mission transmitted to a 105mm artillery battery positioned along the Elsenborn Ridge. The battery commander, a first lieutenant from Knoxville named Waverly, received the fire mission, confirmed coordinates, and ordered his guns to fire within 4 minutes of the original mortar launch. He did not know there was a man in a tree anywhere near those coordinates. He did not know about the logging road or the 33 German soldiers who were no longer using it. He was doing his job. It was the 319th fire mission his battery had executed since the offensive began. The German mortar crew received the incoming artillery with 45 seconds of warning, enough to abandon the tubes and run, not enough to fire a third salvo. They ran. In the tree, Daniel waited 60 seconds after the silence confirmed what he could not explain. Then he slowly unclenched his hands from the branch above him. He checked his rifle. He checked his ammunition. His hands were trembling, not from cold alone, but from what the nervous system does after processing what it has just been through. He held his palms flat against the bark and waited until the trembling stopped. He thought about the silence where the third salvo should have been and could not account for it. He decided it did not matter. He was alive. The road below was still empty. The job was not finished. He resettled his position, retied the parachute cord, and went back to watching the road. By the dawn of December 20th, the 64th hour, the cold had stopped being a condition and had become a presence. 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Not the cold that inconveniences or even the cold that makes outdoor work miserable. This was the cold that dismantles a human body in a systematic, organized way, working through layers of thermal protection like a patient craftsman. Daniel had lost feeling in his feet around 2 o'clock in the morning. True sensory absence, as though his feet belonged to someone else and he was merely aware of their location without being connected to them. His hands still had feeling, but the feeling came in cycles. 15 minutes of full function, precise and responsive, then a 10-minute window where fine motor control degraded, where the distance between what his brain told his fingers to do and what his fingers actually did stretched into something unreliable. He learned the cycle. He timed his reloads to the good windows. The first symptoms of hypothermia had been presenting since the previous night. A drowsiness with more weight than ordinary tiredness, something that pulled downward with a specific and unmistakable gravity, a slowed lag in the connection between observation and conclusion, that a person who has never experienced it would not notice, but that Daniel noticed the way a mechanic notices a half-second hesitation in an engine that was previously smooth. He managed it by acknowledging it, accepting it as a variable, and adjusting accordingly. He moved through controlled isometric exercises every 30 minutes, tightening and releasing large muscle groups to generate internal heat without creating visible motion. He rationed his water carefully. He counted his breathing because the counting kept his mind anchored to the present. Then, in the early morning grey, he looked down at the road and saw his father's face among a group of German soldiers moving through the pre-dawn light. He recognized it as a hallucination immediately. His father was in Brooklyn, working the docks. But the face was there for a clear, complete moment before resolving back into the features of men he did not know. He filed it, understood what it meant about his physiological state, and went back to watching the road. Below him, Callahan had watched the mortar barrage the previous day with an expression his men later described as the most frightening thing they had witnessed during the entire war. Not panic. Callahan never showed panic. But something close to grief, controlled and compressed, the kind a man allows himself for 1 or 2 seconds before sealing it away. When the third salvo failed to come, Callahan had closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and went back to doing what needed to be done. At 7:34 in the morning of December 20th, the sound of engines came from the east. Not a patrol, not a probing force, something large and deliberate and committed. Daniel heard it from the tree, and his body responded before his mind fully processed what it meant. A physiological alertness that cut through the hypothermic fog and brought him to a readiness that had no relationship to how he felt. He did not feel capable of what the next 30 minutes would require. None of that mattered. His hands would find the good windows. They always had. The force that appeared on the eastern end of the road was a full platoon, 41 men, supported by 2 armored half-tracks with MG-42 machine guns on pintle mounts. They did not walk. The half-tracks came fast, pushing 20 miles per hour on the frozen road, the infantry moving at a run behind them, staying low, using the vehicles as moving cover. The machine guns opened up before they reached the first bodies from the previous days. They were firing blind, suppressing both sides of the road with continuous overlapping streams, filling the tree line with lead on the theory that volume of fire would neutralize a sniper who needed stillness to operate. It was not an unintelligent theory. What they did not account for was that Daniel was 40 feet above their effective suppression zone. The rounds from the MG-42s tore through the lower canopy with a sound like fabric ripping, splintering branches, filling the middle air with flying wood fragments and the sharp smell of freshly cut pine. Daniel felt the platform shudder as a branch 6 inches below his feet was shredded by a burst that came within 3 feet of his legs. He held his position against the trunk and waited until the burst tracked away. Then he began firing. He engaged at 900 yards, targeting the lead half-track's driver. At that range, through a narrow vision port on a moving vehicle, it was not a certain shot. His first round sparked off the armored plate to the right of the port. He worked the bolt, adjusted 2 inches left for the vehicle's movement and 1 inch down for the revised ballistic drop, and fired again. The half-track swerved hard left. It crossed the road shoulder and drove into the frozen bank at speed, the front end dropping into the ditch and the rear end rising before the whole vehicle ground to a halt against the base of a large spruce. Soldiers poured out of the back and ran for the tree line. Daniel found them in his scope one at a time, working with a precision that had no relationship to aggression or anger. It was purely mechanical. The same state he had entered on the rooftops of Brooklyn when everything except the shot ceased to exist. He killed 4 of them before they reached cover. The second half-track kept coming. Its gunner had found a rhythm on the MG-42, sending long bursts into the southern tree line in the vicinity of Daniel's position, adjusting correctly with each burst. Daniel could hear the rounds impacting the oak above him in a cluster, working systematically closer to his platform. He found the gunner in his scope, visible from the shoulders up behind the gun shield, head forward, eye to the sight, fully committed to the weapon. His hands were in the unreliable window now. He forced deliberateness into them. He fired. The shot missed, deflected by a gust arriving at exactly the wrong moment. He worked the bolt, adjusted, fired again. The machine gun stopped. The second half-track continued up the road 30 yards before the driver stopped, making it a stationary target. Daniel was already shifting to the infantry, who had lost their momentum the moment the second gun fell silent. 41 men reduced to 28, their armor neutralized, their suppressing fire gone, facing an invisible shooter they still had not located. The attack had lasted 9 minutes. At 8:09 in the morning, what remained of the platoon broke north. They moved fast, leaving their dead on the road and in the ditches, carrying 2 wounded men between them. Daniel watched them go through his scope and did not fire at retreating men. He lowered the rifle. He looked at the road below, at the 2 disabled half-tracks and the 18 bodies lying between them, at the absolute stillness that had returned to the valley after 35 minutes of violence, at the snow falling in gentle, indifferent flakes already beginning to cover what had happened here. His hands were shaking in the cold window now. He waited it out. He thought about his father on the docks in winter, cold to the bone, doing what needed doing. He settled his weight into the tree and he waited. At 2:47 in the afternoon of December 20th, 1944, the first American soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division appeared on the logging road from the west. They came carefully, moving in a dispersed formation with rifles up and eyes moving, because the intelligence they had received described this sector as actively contested, and the bodies ahead of them confirmed that the intelligence had been, if anything, understated. There were 18 fresh bodies in the road and the ditches combined, plus 2 disabled half-tracks sitting at angles that told a story of sudden, violent stops. There were older bodies further east, men who had been lying in the snow long enough that the falling flakes had softened their outlines, giving them the look of things that had always been part of the landscape. The sergeant leading the advance element stopped at the western edge of the body field and looked at what was in front of him for a long moment. He had been in the war long enough to have a working taxonomy of what different kinds of combat left behind. What he was looking at did not fit neatly into any category he had. He was still trying to understand it when Brendan Callahan appeared from the tree line to the south with 11 men behind him, moving carefully on stiff legs, looking like men who had not slept in several days because they had not slept in several days. Callahan identified himself and his unit. The sergeant shook his hand and asked what had happened on this road. Callahan looked at the bodies. He looked at the half-tracks. He looked up at the tree line behind his position, at the massive oaks with their bare winter canopies against the grey Belgian sky. "One man," Callahan said. The sergeant looked at him. "One man did this," Callahan said again, not as explanation, but as a statement he was still in some part of himself processing. "He's still up there." Callahan went to the tree himself. He stood at the base of the white oak and looked up into the canopy and called Daniel's name. A long pause followed, long enough that Callahan's hand moved toward his pistol by reflex, preparing for the worst kind of answer, which was no answer at all. Then, movement. Slow, deliberate, the movement of a body that has been in one position so long that changing it requires conscious negotiation with each part. A shape descending through the bare branches, moving from handhold to foothold with the careful progress of a man whose hands and feet are not fully his own anymore. Daniel came down the last 10 feet and dropped to the frozen ground, and his legs folded completely beneath him. No drama, no sound, simply a body presenting an honest accounting of what it had left, which was not much. 4 soldiers caught him before he went fully down. They held him upright while his legs relearned what standing required. Callahan stepped in front of him and looked at his face, at the frost accumulated on his eyebrows and the wool wrap around his jaw, at the grey cast to his skin, at his eyes, which were still present and focused in a way that seemed almost unreasonable given what the rest of him looked like. Callahan reached into his coat and produced his canteen. He held it out. Daniel took it with both hands and drank. Neither man said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said in the particular language these 2 men shared, which was the language of practical facts and necessary actions. The necessary action was warmth and food and medical attention. The practical fact was that the road below them was closed, had been closed for 72 hours and 28 minutes, and would not be reopening. "How many rounds?" Callahan asked finally. 114 fired, Daniel said. His voice was rough in a way that suggested he had not spoken in a long time. 87 confirmed. Callahan looked at him. He looked at the road. He looked back at Daniel. "Get him to the aid station," he said to the men holding Daniel upright. "Now." He watched them move off toward the road. He stood alone at the base of the oak tree for another minute, looking up into the canopy at the platform 40 feet above, the pine boughs, the parachute cord still tied around the trunk, the small shelf of existence where a 22-year-old boy from Brooklyn had spent 3 days doing something the manual said was impossible. Then Callahan turned and followed his men out of the forest. The farmhouse was 5 miles west of the line. It had been requisitioned by the battalion staff 3 days earlier and now served as both command post and forward aid station, its stone rooms divided between men with maps and men with wounds. Daniel arrived wrapped in 2 army blankets, his boots cut off because they could not be removed any other way, his feet wrapped in dry wool socks someone had produced from somewhere. He ate hot broth that tasted of salt and little else, and then ate it again when they brought him more. A medical officer examined his feet. Frost nip, not full frostbite. The difference between temporary damage and permanent loss. He would have feeling in both feet within 48 hours. His hands were already returning. He slept for 11 hours. When he woke, it was December 21st, and Captain Gerald Hargrove and Major Edmund Schiff were sitting across a wooden table in the farmhouse's back room, waiting to decide what to do with him. The room was warm. That was the first thing Daniel registered. The physical shock of actual warmth after 72 hours in temperatures that had not risen above 15 degrees. He sat in a wooden chair across the table from the 2 officers and felt the warmth working into him from outside while he was still generating it from inside, and the combination produced a drowsiness he had to actively resist. Hargrove spoke first. He was a compact, precise man in his late 30s who had been a prosecutor in civilian life and brought to military intelligence the skill of a man who believes that sufficient pressure applied to sufficient facts will always produce the truth. He laid a folder on the table. He opened it. He read from Daniel's file with a neutrality that was its own form of accusation. Private First Class Daniel Caruso, 99th Infantry Division, on the evening of December 17th, had unilaterally elected to occupy a static sniper position in direct violation of standing orders requiring relocation after a maximum of 3 firing positions, had remained in that position for 72 hours and 28 minutes, had made no attempt to withdraw when the position came under direct mortar fire, had continued offensive operations without authorization from any officer above the rank of sergeant. Hargrove closed the folder. "Do you understand," he said, "that what you did constitutes disobeying standing orders under field conditions?" "Yes, sir," Daniel said. "Do you understand that Sergeant Callahan had no authority to authorize what you did, and that his consent, whatever form it took, does not constitute legal, military authorization?" "Yes, sir." "Then explain to me," Hargrove said, leaning forward, "exactly what was going through your mind when you decided that your judgment superseded the judgment of the United States Army." Daniel looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know what to say, but the quiet of a man choosing precisely how to say it. "The doctrine was written for open engagements," Daniel said. "Mobile front, open terrain, enemy counter-sniper assets in coordinated positions. In those conditions, shoot and relocate is correct. I don't dispute it. But command wasn't present to assess the ground," Daniel said. "The logging road was a primary supply artery for a German SS division. The terrain was dense enough to neutralize the advantages that relocation doctrine is designed to exploit. In those specific conditions, a fixed position was not only viable, it was more effective than any mobile engagement could have been. I made the decision I believed would kill the most Germans and save the most American lives." The room was quiet. Outside, the distant percussion of artillery rolled across the Belgian countryside with the measured regularity that had become the background sound of this entire war. Inside, the silence between the three men held like something with physical weight. Hargrove said, "That is not your decision to make. You are a private, you follow orders, you do not create new doctrine."
"With respect, sir," Daniel said, his voice unchanged in pitch or pace. "Someone has to." Hargrove's jaw tightened. He looked at Schiff. Major Edmund Schiff had not spoken since Daniel entered the room. He was older than Hargrove by perhaps 8 years, with the broad-shouldered, settling quality of a man who has been large all his life and is now carrying it differently. He had spent the last 3 days looking at maps.
He had spent this morning looking at the intelligence report from the logging road sector. The body counts, the vehicle losses, the German command decision to reroute their supply column 2 miles east on the night of December 19th, adding 6 hours to their logistics timeline at a critical moment in the offensive. 6 hours. In the mathematics of the Battle of the Bulge, 6 hours of supply delay to an SS Panzer division was not an abstraction. It was fuel that did not reach tanks, ammunition that did not reach artillery positions, a window of time during which things could go differently than they otherwise would have. He looked at the map. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Hargrove. 87 confirmed kills, Schiff said quietly, from one position, over 72 hours. He paused. The German 12th SS rerouted their entire supply column for this sector because of what happened on that road.
Hargrove said, "The method is irrelevant to the question of whether orders were obeyed." "The method," Schiff said, "is the only thing that's relevant to whether we understand what happened here." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been in this war since North Africa. I've read a great many after-action reports. I've never read one like this." Another silence. Hargrove looked at the folder. He looked at Daniel.
The prosecutor in him was constructing a case that was technically airtight, and he knew it, and he also knew that Schiff was not going to let him present it. "There will be no court-martial," Schiff said. His voice was even and final, in the way that a major's voice is final to a captain. "There will be a formal reprimand entered in the service record. The reprimand will stand. That is the acknowledgement that standing orders exist for reasons, and that unilateral deviation, regardless of outcome, cannot go entirely unaddressed." He looked directly at Daniel. "You were right, Caruso," he said. "That is the most dangerous thing a soldier can be, because if you had been wrong, you would be dead, and men from your squad might be dead with you, and we would be having a very different conversation. The fact that you were right does not mean that being right was certain. Do you understand the distinction?" Daniel held the major's gaze. "Yes, sir." "Good." Schiff gathered the papers in front of him. "We are forwarding the tactical record of this engagement to the division training cadre for analysis. If the methodology holds up under review, and based on what I have read, I believe it will be evaluated for potential doctrinal revision." He stood. "That is all." He was almost to the door when he stopped without turning. "Doesn't make you right," he said quietly. "Makes you useful. There is a difference. Remember it." Then he left. Hargrove sat a moment longer, looking at Daniel with the expression of a man who has watched something happen that he finds professionally unsatisfying and has no recourse about. He closed the folder and stood. "Get some sleep," he said, without warmth. "The war isn't over." Daniel Caruso returned to Brooklyn in September 1945. He came back on a Tuesday morning, arriving at Penn Station with a duffel bag and a service record that contained, near the bottom of page 3, a formal letter of reprimand for violation of standing field orders during the Ardennes campaign, December 1944. The letter was precise and bureaucratic and permanent. He took the subway to Red Hook. He walked 3 blocks from the station to the building on Van Brunt Street. He climbed 4 flights and knocked on the door of the apartment where his family had lived for 22 years. His mother opened the door and looked at him for a moment and then held him in the particular way that mothers hold sons who have come back from places where sons do not always come back from. His father shook his hand. Marco Caruso looked at his son with the careful eyes of a man who knows what a body looks like after it has been used to its limit. He nodded, once, slowly. Then he went back to the kitchen. The nod contained everything Marco Caruso needed to say. Daniel did not tell them about the tree. He did not tell them about the road, or the 72 hours, or the 87. When his mother asked what he had done in the war, he said infantry. When she pressed, he said it was very cold and that he was glad to be home, and that the meatballs smelled exactly the way he had remembered them when he was trying to remember good things. She fed him. He ate. That was enough for that day. He found work at LaGuardia Airport the following spring, hired as a ground maintenance mechanic through a veterans employment program the city had established to absorb the returning men. The work suited him. Engines were honest. They behaved according to principles that did not shift based on circumstances or the judgment of men who were not present to assess the ground. An engine either ran or it did not, and if it did not, the reason existed in the physical world and could be found and corrected. He was good at finding the reasons. He met Marie Donovan at a parish dance in Woodside in the spring of 1948. She was 23 years old, daughter of a Queen's electrician, with dark hair and the particular quality of intelligence that expressed itself not through conversation but through observation. She watched things carefully before she spoke about them, which meant that when she spoke, it was worth listening to. Daniel recognized the quality because he shared it. They married in October 1948. They moved to a house in Jackson Heights, a 2-story brick row house with a narrow backyard that got reasonable afternoon light from the south. Joseph was born in 1950, Angela in 1952, Paul in 1955. The house filled with the noise of children and the organized chaos of a working-class family in post-war Queens. Daniel worked his shifts. He came home, he ate dinner with his family, he fixed things that needed fixing on weekends. He was not, by any external measure, a complicated man. Marie knew other things. She knew that on nights when rain came in hard from the south, Daniel sometimes woke at 2 or 3 in the morning and sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and did not come back to bed for an hour. She knew that on the 4th of July, when the neighborhood fired its amateur artillery of bottle rockets and cherry bombs into the Queen's night sky, Daniel's hands went still in a way that was not relaxation. She knew that he had never, in their entire marriage, agreed to a war movie at the theater. He always had a reason. He always found one. She loved him in the full understanding of these things. She never required him to explain them. In the spring of 1946, before they moved to Jackson Heights, Daniel had purchased a white oak sapling from a nursery in New Jersey. He drove out on a Saturday, selected the tree himself, not the largest or most impressive, but the one with the straightest trunk and the densest branching pattern, and brought it back in the bed of a borrowed truck. He planted it in the narrow yard behind the Red Hook building, digging the hole carefully enough that his neighbor, watching from a window, commented later that she had never seen a man treat a tree like it was something that needed not to be disturbed. He never explained why he planted it. Marie noticed that he tended it with a consistency he did not apply to other tasks, checking the soil in dry weather, clearing debris from the base each fall. She did not ask. She had learned, in the way that people learn the shape of the silences in their marriages, that this was one of the questions that would not produce an answer, not because he was hiding something from her, but because the answer existed in a place he did not have language for. He would never have language for it. The tree grew, and he tended it, and that was enough. In March 1945, 3 months after the logging road, 3 months before the war in Europe ended, the United States Army published a revised edition of its sniper training manual. The revision was 47 pages. Most of it was incremental adjustment based on accumulated combat experience, refinements to ranging techniques, updated camouflage methodology, revised protocols for urban engagement. The kind of document that military organizations produce continuously, the ongoing translation of what has been learned in blood into what will be taught in training. But on page 31 in section 7, subsection 3, paragraph 4, there was something new. It read, "In defensive positions with confirmed friendly support elements and favorable terrain cover, snipers may maintain static positions beyond standard 3-shot relocation limitations, provided continuous reassessment of enemy counter-sniper and indirect fire threat. Positional decisions must account for terrain, visibility, enemy response time, and the tactical value of the fixed position relative to the risk of exposure during relocation. Combat analysis from winter 1944 to 45 operations demonstrates the viability of extended static engagement under specific conditions. No name, no unit, no location, no description of the engagement that had produced the analysis, just the doctrine, clean and practical and permanent. Joseph Caruso enlisted in the Army in 1968 at 18 years old. He was trained as a rifleman, then cross-trained as a designated marksman, then selected for advanced sniper qualification at Fort Benning, Georgia, where he demonstrated an aptitude for long-range precision shooting that his instructors noted in his file with the particular emphasis that exceptional scores receive when they exceed expectations by a significant margin. At Fort Benning, in the advanced qualification course, Joseph's instructor, a veteran master sergeant named Delbert Houck, who had been teaching precision marksmanship since 1955, spent a full morning session on what he called exceptional engagement doctrine. He taught from the manual, which he had memorized in the way that men who have taught the same material for 13 years memorize things, not as words on a page, but as understood truth. He quoted section 7, subsection 3, paragraph 4. He explained its origins briefly. Winter Operations, Ardennes Sector, 1944, a combat record that had justified a revision to doctrine that had previously been absolute. He had no name because the manual had no name. Houck had always assumed the revision came from a composite of engagements, from the aggregated wisdom of multiple actions during the bulge. Joseph wrote it down in his field notebook. He filed it with the disciplined efficiency of a soldier learning material he expects to need. He needed it in February 1991. He was 40 years old by then, a career soldier, a sergeant first class attached to a light infantry unit positioned in northern Saudi Arabia at the beginning of Operation Desert Storm. On the third day of the ground war, his unit was tasked with securing a road junction east of the Kuwaiti border through which Iraqi armor was expected to attempt a flanking movement. Joseph was positioned in a concealed overwatch location on a raised escarpment overlooking the junction, a fixed position because the terrain offered no viable alternative, because the open desert floor below the escarpment provided no cover during movement, because moving meant being seen, and being seen meant being killed. He held that position for 38 hours. He did not move. He engaged multiple targets and maintained control of the junction until his unit's armor arrived to secure it permanently. When the engagement was reviewed in the after-action report, his commanding officer cited his positional discipline as a primary factor in the mission's success. Joseph, in the debrief, cited Section 7, subsection 3, paragraph 4, the doctrine that had told him explicitly that what he was doing was not only permitted but supported by combat evidence. He flew home to Fort Bragg in April 1991. He called his father from the base. Daniel answered the phone. They talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than they usually talked, because Daniel understood enough about what had happened in the Gulf to know that his son was processing it in the way men process these things, Not immediately, not directly, but through the oblique routes that time and distance and ordinary conversation gradually make passable. He did not tell Joseph about the tree. He did not tell him about the logging road or the reprimand or the 72 hours. He asked about the food in Saudi Arabia, which Joseph found funny. Then he asked about Joseph's unit and listened carefully, and at the end of the call told his son he was proud of him in the particular unadorned way that Daniel Caruso expressed the things that mattered most. He hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen for a while. Outside, the white oak in the backyard was bare in the late winter, its branches against the grey Queen's sky. It had grown into something substantial over 45 years. A real tree now, with a trunk that required 2 hands to encircle and a canopy that shaded half the yard in summer. The 3 main branches had grown together at the top in a fork that, from the right angle, looked almost like a natural platform where they intersected. Daniel sat in the kitchen and looked at the tree through the window and did not explain to himself or to anyone else why it was there. He had long since stopped trying. He died on February the 3rd, 1997. A heart attack, clean and final, at 74 years old. He had worked at LaGuardia Airport until 1982, retired, and spent 15 years fixing cars in the garage with the patience and precision that had defined everything he had ever done. He died in the house in Jackson Heights in the morning before the rest of the household was awake. Marie found him. She said later that he looked like a man who had been very still for a very long time and had simply continued. The funeral was 4 days later. St. Monica's Church in Jackson Heights, then the cemetery in Flushing, the February ground hard and grey. The parish turned out in the solid, reliable way of people who understand that showing up is itself the statement. Among the attendees was a man named Brendan Callahan. He was 76 years old and had driven down from South Boston, which required more of him than it once would have. He walked with a cane. His face had become the face of a very old man, but his eyes had not, which gave him the quality of someone who is further inside than the exterior suggests. Callahan sat beside Joseph Caruso at the reception after the burial. They had met before, at family events over the years, but had never had a real conversation. Callahan set down his plate. He looked at Joseph. "I want to tell you something about your father," he said. Joseph looked at him. Callahan told him everything. He told it slowly and completely in the way that men of his age tell the things they have been keeping, not dramatically, not with performance, but with the careful, unadorned precision of someone who wants the account to be accurate, because accuracy is the last form of respect they can offer. He told him about the logging road and the oak tree and the 72 hours. He told him about the mortar barrage and the final assault and what it had looked like from below, listening to the shots coming down from a position 40 feet above the ground. He told him about the after-action review and the reprimand and what Schiff had said. He told him about sitting under the tree all night with a pistol on his knee and that he had never told Daniel, and that he was not sure whether telling him now was a kindness or a confession or both. Joseph listened without speaking. When Callahan described the doctrine revision, Section 7, Subsection 3, Paragraph 4, no name, no location, just the policy that came out of one man's 3 days in a frozen tree, Joseph went very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but its opposite. The kind that comes when something lands in a place that has been waiting for it, without knowing it was waiting. He looked at Callahan. "I used that doctrine," Joseph said. His voice was level and careful. "Desert Storm, February of 91, I held a fixed position for 38 hours because Section 7 Sub 3 told me it was operationally justified." He paused. "I cited it in the after-action report." Callahan held his gaze. The room continued around them. Conversation, the sound of children, someone's glass set down on a table, the ordinary percussion of a family gathered against loss. Callahan heard none of it. He looked at Joseph Caruso, son of Daniel Caruso, who had held a position in the Saudi desert for 38 hours using a doctrine written into the manual because of what his father had done on a road in Belgium in December 1944. "Then your father saved your life twice," Callahan said quietly. "Once, when you were a young soldier in the Gulf who didn't know where the doctrine came from. And once in Belgium in 1944 for every American who came through that sector alive." He paused. "And he never knew either time." The room continued. Grief moved through it in its ordinary, patient way. Joseph looked at his hands for a long moment. Then he looked up at the window, at the bare winter light coming through the glass. In the summer of 2003, Joseph Caruso flew to Belgium. He had the description Callahan had given him 6 years earlier, detailed and specific, the kind of description a man gives when he has been carrying something long enough that every detail has been worn smooth and certain by time. The road, the hill, the forest south of Rocherath, the particular oak tree with the 3-branch intersection 40 feet up. He rented a car in Brussels and drove east into the Ardennes. The landscape was green and rolling and unremarkable, the way landscapes become unremarkable when 60 years of ordinary life has grown over the layer of history underneath. He drove through small towns and past farms and along hedgerow roads that gave no indication of what had moved through them in the winter of 1944. He found the logging road at the eastern end of the sector. Most of it had been incorporated into a regional highway, paved, marked, driven by people going somewhere with no particular reason to think about where they were. But at the point where the old track curved back into the forest, the original road surface was still unpaved, a historical remnant preserved without being marked, the way places sometimes hold on to things without knowing precisely what they are holding. He walked into the forest from the road's edge, moving south along the hill line, counting his paces against Callahan's description. The trees were large. 60 years of growth had made them large in the way that old growth becomes large, not just tall but wide and settled, with the confident presence of things that have been in one place for a very long time. He was looking for the largest, for a trunk that would have been substantial even in 1944, for the 3-branch configuration at 40 feet. He found it. He stood at the base and looked up. The 3 branches diverged from the main trunk at a height he estimated at 38 to 40 feet, intersecting and then spreading outward to create a fork that was unmistakably a natural platform. Not built, but grown, a place where the tree had arranged itself into the shape of a position. From this vantage, the ground sloped toward the road, and through the trees he could see the pale strip of the old track running east to west, 800 yards, roughly. He stood there for a long time. The forest was quiet in the way that European forests are quiet, a full, layered silence that absorbs sound rather than simply lacking it. Birds somewhere above him, wind in the upper canopy, the distant sound of a car on the paved road to the north. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He had printed it at a copy shop in Brussels. A reproduction of the relevant page from the 1945 edition of the Sniper Manual, photographed from the archive copy at the Army Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which he had visited 2 weeks before this trip. Page 31, Section 7, Subsection 3, Paragraph 4. He unfolded it and read it one more time. The same words that had been in his hands in the Saudi desert. The same doctrine that had told him, officially, with the full authority of the United States Army behind it, that staying still was justified, that stillness was a weapon. No name in the text, no mention of Rocherath, or Belgium, or December 1944, or a 22-year-old private from Brooklyn who had tied himself to a tree with parachute cord and held a road for 72 hours. Just the doctrine, clean, permanent, utterly anonymous. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. He placed his right hand flat against the bark of the white oak. The bark was cold and deeply furrowed, the surface of something that has been alive long enough to accumulate that kind of texture. He held his hand there and did not speak. Below him, through the trees, the road was empty. A car passed on the paved highway to the north, moving at speed, going somewhere else entirely. The driver did not look toward the forest. Joseph stood at the base of the tree until the light began to change in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the ridge to the west and pulling the shadows long across the frozen floor of the Ardennes. Around him, the forest was utterly still. He did not need to explain what he was doing there. Some things do not require explanation. Some things simply require presence, the acknowledgement that you stood in a place, that you understood what happened there, that you carried it forward. He stood for another minute. Then he turned and walked back toward the road. The Sniper Manual of the United States Army still contains Section 7, Subsection 3, Paragraph 4. The language has been updated twice since 1945 to reflect changes in equipment and tactical doctrine, but the essential principle has not changed and will not change because it was never a product of doctrine to begin with. It was a product of a rooftop in Brooklyn, of a 14-year-old boy reading Wind Through Chimney Smoke, of patience practiced in poverty until it became something beyond patience, a way of existing in the world that made a man invisible when invisibility was survival. The army punished the man and kept the method. They wrote his idea into every sniper manual that followed, trained a generation of men with it, and those men trained another generation. They entered the reprimand in his service record and the doctrine in the book, and they made both permanent, and the permanent things outlasted everything else. Daniel Caruso went home and fixed engines and planted a tree and raised 3 children and never told any of them what he had done. He lived quietly for 52 years with the knowledge that he had been right and punished for it, and that being right had mattered anyway, which is the thing that men of a certain kind understand and do not need to say out loud to anyone. The oak tree he planted in the yard is still standing. It has outlasted the building in Red Hook, outlasted the neighborhood as he knew it, outlasted him. It does not know what it means. It is just a tree that was planted carefully and tended well and left to grow. And somewhere in the Ardennes, the other tree, the one he did not plant but only chose, stands in the forest with 3 branches meeting 40 feet above the ground, looking down at a road that no longer carries soldiers, offering a clear view of 800 yards to anyone willing to climb high enough and stay still long enough to use it. No name on either tree, no name needed. That was always enough for Daniel Caruso, and in the end, it was more than enough.